Hey everyone, welcome back to That's a Good Card. Today we're going to bring you our first iteration of our That's a Good Commander series. And to start it off, I'm going to hand this over to Kyle, who's super excited to bring his favorite card and commander that he plays. Go for it, Kyle.
All right. Thank you, Ya, for the wonderful introduction. Yeah, I'm super excited for today's episode. We are going to be highlighting my personal favorite commander, Korvold Fey Cursed King. Now, I'll give you a little description of what Korvold does. Korvold is a 5-cost card, 2 colorless, 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green. He is a Jund commander. He is a legendary dragon noble creature with flying, and his text reads, whenever Korvold Fey Cursed King enters the battlefield or attacks, sacrifice another permanent. Whenever you sacrifice a permanent, put a 1/1 counter on Korvold and draw a card. Korvold is a 4-power, 4-toughness creature. This is my favorite commander for a number of reasons. One, it happens to be the first commander deck that I ever made in paper and was able to play with. This was probably about a year and a half ago when I was getting started into CEDH and I was looking for a commander. Basically, Ya and a couple of our other friends gave me a list of commanders to look at and said, hey, take a look at these cards, pick what stands out to you. And I had played Korvold in a Brawl deck that one of my friends had, so I already knew the deck, I already knew the commander. I love Jund, I love the colorway of Jund, and I picked it out of the blue, found a deck list online.
I remember that. I remember you coming to me and going, hey, I think I found the list I wanted to run. I think you even told me about the Discord and how cool that group of brewers were. And so, yeah, I totally remember that.
Yeah, shout out to that Discord. I'm still a member of it today. That's the Korvold Discord. And the deck list that I originally printed from was a really old version of the Mad Kings deck list.
Yeah.
He's still super prominent in that Discord. Shout out. I think his name's Eric. But yeah, I took that deck list originally about a year and a half ago, and I have been updating it and tinkering it and making it into my own deck to what it is today. And yeah, so let me talk a bit about the reasons why I was drawn to Korvold and why I ended up sticking with it. Because to this day, like I said, this is one of my most played decks. I still love playing it. Whenever we play, I'll pull it out. I absolutely love this deck. So the first thing of the, 4 main topics the 4 main things that Korvold covers is that it's a card draw engine in the command zone. So just off of the sacrificing any permanent, you get to draw a card. Super powerful in CEDH in the format in general. Drawing cards is pretty damn good.
It's the meta right now, right? I think that's one of the coolest things about this commander is the way he goes about drawing you cards is kind of contrary to how I approached the game when I first started, is like sacking things to gain advantage almost goes against what I used to think Magic was about, which is like gaining things. And so
exactly. It is a little counterproductive in a way, but it works so well when you know what you're doing. But yeah, the idea of basically destroying your own stuff to draw cards is interesting for sure. The second thing that really draws me to Korvold in general is that he's just a big-bodied flyer. I think flying is pretty rare in CEDH right now. There's a couple of cards that are really prevalent, like Crom, Ludovic's Opus, who's in Blue Farm, who has flying. But for the most part, you don't see a lot of flying cards. So I find myself in situations where I'm flying my massive commander over people's boards that have no answers to it. The one thing I do see often is people running Birds of Paradise. So a lot of times people will chump block with the Birds of Paradise. And I don't know why, that's just the funniest image in my head of there's like massive 15/15 dragon
and
flying
a toucan
through the air.
Yeah.
And then,
I agree.
And Toucan Sam just sitting there, just getting absolutely obliterated.
I'll save us.
Yeah.
Flies into the sun.
Exactly. But you know what? Shout out Birds of Paradise, because I have not attacked people for that exact reason many times. But yeah, so the third thing that's a little more inconsistent, but still a really powerful aspect of this commander is that it's a sack outlet in the command zone. So like we said before, anytime it attacks or enters the battlefield, Korvold sacrifices another permanent. Fun note, another is very important because there's certain times when you play this deck where Korvold is the only thing that you have on your board.
Yeah.
And if you do attack with Korvold, you do not sacrifice another permanent. Or you do not sacrifice Korvold, rather, because you have no other permanents. So Korvold does not sack himself, which is great. But anyway, what I was saying was the sack outlet aspect of Korvold is super important because this deck, and we'll get into it a little bit more later, is a graveyard recursion deck. So your graveyard is really important to you, and being able to sack things and put it into your graveyard can be a really powerful tool. Now, I say that's inconsistent because once you play it, you get it one time, and then every turn you'll only get to really sack one thing with it.
Yeah.
So it's not something that you can, constantly sack at instant speed as an ability like another commander could do. So it's a little inconsistent, but it's still a powerful aspect of the card.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you said, I think the cool thing is that if you can find yourself some sack outlets, which I'm sure you'll walk us through later, you can really kind of get this engine going. And I think the fact that it is a big-bodied flyer, there are a couple of commanders, right? The other one that you can think of is Atraxa, which has almost every keyword that you want. Tivit is another really big flyer. Actually, if anything, Korvold shows his age because he doesn't have as many keywords attached to him as you would almost want in this day and age. He does have a good amount of abilities, and it is pretty cool to me that you get to play a dragon, right? Like almost like the original how EDH commander got its name, right? Elder Dragon Highlanders, right? Which is what the EDH stands for. Being able to play a dragon is pretty cool to me.
Yeah. Let's talk about the last thing that has drawn me to Korvold. The last aspect of the card is that it's a 3-color commander, which is great. In CEDH, the more colors that your commander lets you play, probably the better, ? A lot of the most powerful decks in the format are 4 or 5 color commanders. It's pretty difficult to be a 2-color or a monocolor commander and be successful. And then that's kind of the reason why you only see a certain amount of those 2-color and 1-color commanders. There's just not as many cards that are powerful enough on their own to be able to handle not having access to certain colors.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that 3 colors is kind of that sweet spot. 4-color good stuff is also really good. I mean, the best, we've talked about this before, the best deck in the format is probably Timna Krom, which is a 4-color, all of the good things. It's missing green, right? And because green is arguably the weakest color in CEDH at the very least, I actually was looking through my decks that I have, and I have the fewest 3-color decks. I really like 2-color commanders. I run 5 or 6 2-color commanders and only 1 3-color commander that I can think of. No, I have 2. I have 2 decks that run 3 colors, and then only 1 5-color good stuff through Najila. So I think Korvold, the appealing thing is being able to have access to 2 of the strongest colors in Magic right now, black and red, and then green getting you creature tutors, which I think is really important with at least the way you run this deck.
Yeah, and that's kind of how the deck does feel. It does feel like it's a Rakdos deck with a little sprinkle of green.
Yeah.
I really don't run that many green cards in this deck, but the ones I do run are the best ones. So that's kind of how the deck functions. So something I want to bring up is, it's kind of funny. I've played probably, I know I have, I believe it's 40-something games of Korvold that I've recorded, and that was after I started tracking my games, but I probably have a ton of more games before that. I've never actually played against another Korvold. Our pod is pretty tight-knit, and no one else has another Korvold deck, so I've never played against my own deck. Even when I've played against people I don't know, I don't really see a lot of Korvold. So what I want to ask you today, because of that, is I want to know what you, as a non-Korvold player, what you think Korvold's game plan is. And correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, have you ever played Korvold?
I've never actually played Korvold. Okay. I think you're the only person I've played that plays Korvold. I've also started tracking I think I kind of got us started on tracking our stats, and I have played 55 different decks. I played against 55 different decks. I've played against Korvold itself. I know I've played against Korvold more than the 10 times I have recorded, but I've played it since we started recording back in December of 2023. I've played against Korvold specifically 10 times. I've lost to it 3 times for a 30% win rate, at least when I play against you. So that's pretty good. That's above the standard EV.
That's above average. That's above average right there.
And I started laughing because when I think of Korvold, I think about the games that stand out to me the most is when you have really kind of started storming off, right? Storming meaning you're playing a bunch of different spells, maybe playing a lot of spells, when in CEDH at least, you may play on average probably anywhere between 1 to 3 spells, right? Depending on like how many resources you have.
That's per turn.
Per turn, right? Per turn. And when I think about you, I think about how sometimes I just look at your board and you have no lands. You may have a lot of treasures, but you literally have sacked all of your lands. You have Korvold and then maybe 2 other creatures. So I think of a Korvold game as playing against a person who does his own land destruction and then but it somehow has a small group of cards of maybe, I don't know, 6 to 8 cards in hand at any given time, and then just goes, well, I'm not sure what I want to do now, I'll pass the turn. That's how I think of Korvold a little bit. But then the games where he goes off, it goes off, and there's almost nothing you can do about it because you're just reanimating Dockside, bringing him back to create more treasure, to sack those treasures, to do more card gain. And I think one of the best things in Magic is drawing cards. And so I definitely think Korvold does that really well.
Yeah. So how do we touched on a little bit, how do you think Korvold players win games?
Actually, that's a really good point. I have some questions about you since I've done some research. But with you in particular, you like to do this Witherbloom. I can't think of his apprentice and Chain of Smog, which basically lets you discard cards to do damage and then continue that. The other way is Dualcaster Twin Flame, right? Yep. That infinite where you basically can make infinite of a Dualcaster Mages and then attack the board. Mm-hmm. I think those are the 2 big ones that I can think of right off the top of my head. I don't think you play any Underworld Breach lines in yours.
I do.
You do?
I do. Yeah.
That's like me saying I play Underworld Breach in Najeela, but I don't think I've ever won with Underworld Breach in Najeela. So I hear what you're saying.
I think my Underworld Breach, for those listeners who listened to our very first episode, I think my Underworld Breach in Korvold is very similar to your Thassa's in Yuriko.
Oh,
where it exists and it's there, but I almost never end up using it as a win line. And I've honestly considered pulling it out, but it is really consistent when I am able to do it, so I decided to keep it in. But anyway, I think you did a good job, yeah. I think that was a great description of, what Korvold is trying to do. With a little highlight about, some of the bad things about Korvold and highlighting, the good things that it does as well. I think a big thing that you mentioned at the beginning is that this is through and through a storm deck. Korvold is trying to play a bunch of spells in their turn. So it's very common to see a Korvold player taking a 15-minute turn. And that's totally fine. That's just what Korvold does. Korvold does what I like to call go fishing, where he will get a bunch of treasures and he will start cracking the treasures one at a time to draw cards one at a time, and kind of doing this guessing game of guessing what mana that they're going to need for the cards that they're drawing into until they basically sculpt together a win or a line to win. But overall, yeah, you did a good job of kind of describing the major win lines. I think the other one I'll mention that you didn't touch upon is just the commander damage.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Of course.
I've swung a 21-21 Korvold into somebody's face.
Against me,
against you many times.
Yes,
many times.
That's right. How did I forget?
Yeah, I think that the consistency of Korvold to just be able to fly and kill somebody is a little underrated. And I think I've probably won more with commander damage than I've won with my Underworld Breachlands, now that I think about it.
That's awesome. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. But let's get into what makes Korvold fun, and why am I drawn to this deck so much, and why would someone else potentially be drawn to this deck?
Yeah, dude, take us to it.
Just little things. I think I find a lot of fun in the niche things that commanders do, or the niche things that certain decks do, that makes kind of like okay stuff into really good stuff, right? Most notably in Korvold, what I feel like is really underrated is that Fetchlands are freaking awesome in Korvold. So Fetchlands in general, for anyone who doesn't know, are lands that you'll play where they come into play, and then you can activate them immediately, pay a life, sacrifice them. Important note, sacrifice them, and then go search for another land and put it into play untapped. So basically it lets you find whatever land that you want in your deck. And in Korvold specifically, not only are they powerful because I can find whatever land I want, but because they sacrifice themselves, I can play a land and then draw a card from the land being played and put a 1/1 counter on my commander.
That's so good.
Just from playing
good.
a fetch land.
That's so good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that's so funny, because normally in Commander, if you draw a land, you're like, oh, I don't need these lands, right? But for me, every time I draw a fetch land, I'm like, oh, this is great. I just get to draw a card and make my guy even bigger.
It's this thing we call in Magic called a cantrip, which is a spell that replaces itself, right? You can play lands for free, one per turn, and you're getting a free cantrip, right? By paying a life and going to get something you need anyways, and then drawing a card, plus putting that 1/1 counter on your commander to make him bigger is huge.
Yeah. So that's a small aspect of Korvold that's very unique to Korvold, is that the fetch lands just feel really, really good in this deck.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Second thing that I really like is that player order doesn't really matter to Korvold. I've found that my win percentage in third or fourth position is actually much higher with Korvold than it is in a lot of other decks, and that's just because this is a deck that revolves around Dockside Extortionist. So when I'm going third or fourth in play order, I actually like it, especially if I'm mulliganing aggressively for Dockside, which is the general strategy in Korvold. If I'm fourth player and position 1 puts down a Soul Ring Mana Crypt, position 2 puts down a Rhystic Study, and position 3 puts down, Jeweled Lotus and a Lotus Petal, right?
You love it.
Then it comes to me on my turn, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this feels so
love
good.
It. You love
Land,
to see it.
Exile Simian Spirit Guide, Dockside. Turn 1, just get 5 treasures, just living the dream. I think the most treasures I've gotten in seat 4, turn 1, was like 8 or 9.
That's awesome.
And it was just incredible. It just feels so good.
Yeah, I think that's huge. This is a really great point, I think, is being able to go third or fourth and that being to your advantage, because statistically being first or second is where you find a lot more wins, right? It's just statistically speaking, it is such an advantage. And to know that going fourth is actually better for you in this specific deck is a really... I don't think I can overstate this enough. Like, that's a really big deal. To be able to go and come out ahead in some way, being last, is a really great part about Korvold.
Yeah. Another fun thing about my specific Korvold deck list that I always like to bring up is that I run Lightning Bolt, and it just fits so well into this deck. And probably a lot of other Korvold players, I think about maybe like 25% of the deck lists I find actually run Lightning Bolt. So it's not that many, just because a lot of people see it as an easy cut. But I have won so many games because of Lightning Bolt. And it's such a good little trick spell that ends up being super satisfying. There's so many times where somebody will ad nauseam aggressively, or utilize their life total a little too much, or Crickle get a little too spicy with paying his life, and a Lightning Bolt just completely shatters someone. Just shatters them. That's pretty cool. And it's also just a versatile spell. So, like, one of the big things that Korvold struggles against is Collector Oof.
Yeah.
If you can't crack your treasures, Korvold is really hard to play, notably because every time, you crack a treasure, you're able to draw a card. So if you Dockside for 6 treasures and then you can crack 6 treasures, you can now draw 6 cards, and Korvold gets +6/+6. That's the gist of the deck. Yep. So being able to have something that can take care of Collector Oof is super valuable, which I think Oof is falling out of the meta a little bit, but anytime I see that card, it is a nightmare for me as a Korvold pilot. Another thing that's great about that Lightning Bolt is with my specific deck list is it is a combo piece. So I can play Lightning Bolt with Dualcaster Mage and Saw in Half, and all of a sudden I have infinite Lightning Bolts.
That's pretty cool.
So it is a way to win the game as well, which is really nice.
Have you won that way?
I've won that way one time.
Oh, yeah. Cool.
Yeah. So I've won that way one time, which out of all the times I played the game, not a crazy amount, but it is possible
satisfying
to win that
when
way.
You can do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Saw in Half Dualcaster in itself already nets you infinite dudes. You get infinite 1/1s, but they don't have haste.
Yeah.
So that's why that's another reason why I really like Lightning Bolt is it's just a combo piece for this deck. Another thing that's really cool is if you enjoy finding your lines as you draw as much as I do, this deck is the right one for you. Korvold you have such a good time just going fishing, just cracking treasures, drawing cards, guessing what mana you need. You're like, oh, okay, I'm gonna crack a treasure for a black, I'm gonna draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold. I'm gonna crack a treasure, put a green, draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold. Just the act of doing that is so satisfying to me because every time I draw a card, I'm just getting a step closer and closer to winning the game.
Yeah, I think that's like a really big thing about this deck when I play against you is that even though you can literally, like I said earlier, be sitting there with no lands in play, the amount of times I've seen you with no lands, but like basically having to pass the turn with mana floating, with unspent mana is much more than I would have thought would be possible, right? The amount of reanimation spells for you to bring back Dockside is pretty crazy. So I think that's really cool. It seems really satisfying each time when you're like, I'm just going to try to draw 5 cards and see if I can win the game. No, I can't. I guess I'll pass, but I have a full grip of cards still.
Yeah, exactly. A funny board state that you'll see often with Korvold players is they'll have like 1,000,000 cards in their hand and no lands. That's the dream.
That's
true. The dream, baby. I don't need lands. I just have half of my deck in my hand. Cool. Another thing that's a small positive for some people, myself included, is that I play Korvold every single game. There's almost never a game where I don't get to play my commander. And the reason why is just this deck has so much fast mana. I don't know why I said manner. This deck has so much fast mana. Got a little southern on you. This deck has so much fast mana that I'm playing. You're playing Korvold turn 1 or turn 2 every single game pretty consistently. So unless you see a Dranith being played right before you, you'll never have those games where you're like, oh, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't even play my commander. It just doesn't happen. There's too many rituals, too much fast mana. So that's a positive for sure. You get to actually feel like you're playing the game.
Real fast before you move on, do you need Korvold to resolve then for you to be able to get yourself going with this deck? Or can you win without it, without your commander?
So it's kind of a two-sided coin. Yes, you can win without your commander. The reason why is because you're in black and you have a ton of tutors. Also, you mentioned it before, you're also in green, and green has great creature tutors.
Yeah.
So a lot of our combos are creature combos. So it'll be Weatherboom Apprentice plus Chain of Smog, or it'll be Stormkill Arnis, Chain of Smog, or it'll be Dualcaster Twin Flame. So all of those are kind of able to be tutored in green, cool. And then the other pieces are able to be tutored in black. So the answer is yes, you can win without Korvold, but it is a lot more difficult because Korvold is your main draw engine. Korvold is how you're going to draw into your win conditions.
Cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Great. Let's kind of get into the downsides of Korvold. So I mentioned how fun it is to go fishing, but I'm sure, you mentioned it already. There are a lot of times where, unfortunately, you'll go fishing and crack all your treasures and draw 5 cards, and all of them will be horrible or exactly what you don't need, which happens a little too often. When you said I pass the turn with a lot of floating mana often, It's not intentional.
Yeah.
it's not because I just have so much mana. I just don't even need it. I don't even need that mana, whatever. No, it's because I've drawn into 4 or 5 lands, or 3 lands and 2 pieces of protection, and I just have no way of winning the game. My fishing trip has ended early, and I walked back home with no fish in the barrel. That's how it feels quite a bit of the time. So I would definitely say that's a downside of this deck, and not to mention when you do crack all those treasures to go fishing, or you attack and kill a land to go fishing, it leaves you with nothing. So this deck is feast or famine 100%. Like, it's by definition feast or famine. You will have nothing on your board except for Korvold when things go wrong. And sometimes you'll feast with Korvold, you'll end up going crazy to try to get a win, and then someone will remove Korvold and stop your win con, and you are left with no lands, no artifacts, no permanents in general, and that's it. You have nothing.
But you did it to yourself, and there's a lot of autonomy there that I think is really it's to be commended. To be able to play, willing to play a commander like this. Actually, something I was going to ask you a little bit later, but I think now's a good time. Do you think that Korvold then is a good deck for a beginner, right? Like how much experience did you kind of have before you tackle like this? You mentioned that this was your first CEDH commander that you put together. How well do you think a listener that's still looking to get into the format would do with Korvold?
So I personally think that this is a very difficult deck to pilot.
Yeah.
But just because it is a difficult deck to pilot doesn't mean a beginner shouldn't pick it up.
Yeah.
This deck has taught me so much about Magic the Gathering, and so much about leveraging your life total and leveraging mana and managing mana through phases. I cannot understate how much this deck will help you learn the game of Magic the Gathering. So I would recommend it to a beginner or someone who is new to CEDH, but they have to be willing to fail early and often.
Exactly. I think that's really great. I think I talk about this with our pod all the time, and like our group of friends, is that choosing decks that stretch you, right? Like that force you to learn more about the game, and then all the intricacies with like timing rules of like when does this trigger or when does this ability actually get to go off. I think I mentioned in the very first podcast how Yuriko taught me all of the different phases of combat, right? And like how you can interact with things. And so awesome. That's exactly kind of what I was hoping for when I asked you that question. It was like, how can a person kind of expect to learn with this deck? And I think that's a really big one. Like the first time I realized, oh, my life total is a resource that I can use, is a really big aha moment, right? In terms of understanding the depth of this game.
Yeah, great question,
So what else do we need to look out for if a person's picking up Korvold?
Yeah, so another thing that can be really difficult with this deck is the susceptibility that you have to graveyard hate. This deck really relies on its graveyard. I run a lot of graveyard recursion. I don't even, out of all the lists, Korvold lists out there, I think I'm on the lower end of graveyard interaction than comparatively to other lists. Some lists run way more graveyard interaction than I do, so they're even more susceptible to the graveyard hate than I am. And I already feel like if I get targeted with graveyard hate, I'm just a dead bug. I feel flipped over and just I can't do anything.
That's a good visual.
Another thing that kind of stinks as just in general as a CDH deck. It's funny. This deck is one of the only Jund decks out there, like in terms of competitive CDH viability.
Yeah.
The reason why is because you just don't have blue or white, right? You don't have access to either of those. And I know a lot of people trash white, but I think that the reason why that happens is because a lot of white decks are either like, you're talking like mono white or you're talking like 2-color with white. I think white as a splash color is super, super important because it provides the best protection in the game. You have Grand Abolisher, you have silence effects. Like, not having access to blue and white means that you are really vulnerable and this deck does feel vulnerable. You have to scrape to the bottom of the barrel to find the worst of the worst protection out there. It feels gross.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think white in CEDH especially honestly feels so strong. And I think Magic has really made, I'm sorry, not Magic, but like WotC, the Wizards of the Coast, has really made a concentrated effort in making white much more playable. And it is a color I look to splash in if I can through any of my commanders. It is actually probably one of my more played colors, as
I think so.
With the exception of Kinnan, right? But he doesn't really need it.
Yeah. Yep. So, I mean, being in Jund, like I said, there's a reason that there's really no other Jund decks that are competitively viable in the tournament scene. They're few and far between.
That's a great point.
So the colors you're in, it's rough. Times are tough out here for us Jund players. Yeah, and the last thing I'll mention that kind of crushes this deck is just rule of law effects. It doesn't play. You're a Storm deck, and Storm decks inherently are trying to play as many cards as they possibly can. The second someone starts taxing you for the spells you're playing or tells you can only play one spell per turn, it's rough. It feels like I'm shaking that magic 8-ball, and then it just says to me, outlook not so good anytime somebody plays a rule of law effect of whether or not I'm going to win this game.
That's fair. I mean, that is why people play white, right? Slow down the game, stop a deck like yours from really storming off and playing to try to win quickly. I guess my last question in terms of like your impression of the deck is like, what turn do you kind of expect to win with this? Like, where's your window of opportunity to win? Like turn 3, turn 4, earlier game? Is it early game better for you or late game better for you?
Definitely early game. This deck is really fast.
Okay.
Played in its best shape, in its best form. I have won with this deck on turn 1, notably turn 1 seat 4, because sometimes you get the dream Dockside. So if you're turn 1 seat 4 with this deck, you can win the game just by playing Dockside and then playing Withermill Apprentice, Chain of Smog. It's that simple, right? You can just win turn 1. So this deck had the absolute top end of this deck is super fast. But I would say consistently speaking, this deck is a win on turn 2, win on turn 3 type of deck. Turn 1 wins are pretty few and far between, and shouldn't ever really be expected. You have to have the miracle turn. Turn 2 wins are definitely out there. I would say in our pod, I think that the only deck that has more consistent turn 2 wins than Korvold is Godo. And I was actually talking to the Godo player in our pod about this. I think that in our pod specifically, Korvold and Godo are probably the fastest decks. So it is a super fast turbo deck. You're playing Adnaz, so you're ready to... And I also play Peer into the Abyss, so I'm ready to sacrifice everything I have to draw half my deck or draw my whole deck, right? And try to win. So cool. So turn 2, turn 3, that's kind of where if everything's firing on all cylinders, that's where I expect to win.
Cool.
All right. Yeah, I think we're going to get into what you're most excited about, which is deck tech time.
Deck tech.
Deck tech. Not to be confused with tech deck. Insert the animation right now.
Right.
Ooh,
Boom.
skateboard. Finger skateboard.
I can't wait.
We'll see if that actually happens. Anyway. Yeah, so let's talk about deck tech. So I've given my deck list to Yaw, and I'll also throw it down in the comment section just so that anyone can take a look at my Korvold deck and see where it's at. I already mentioned before that this deck list is... the bones of it were made from the Mad Kings deck list like a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
And I then spun it. I kind of stopped tracking and all the other Korvold deck lists just because I was getting so many games in that I could kind of decide for myself what felt good and what didn't. But because of that, I've also probably missed out on a lot of really good stuff. So I'm hoping to hear from you, Yaw, and maybe we'll do a deck tech and this old man Korvold player will make some changes and, become a new age Korvold player.
Yeah.
Let's see. What do you got for me?
So real fast, just so that everybody kind of understands how I approach this is like, I wanted to make sure I had an idea of what this deck is about. And then also the way I kind of always look at my decks is I compare my deck to decks that are doing well in the tournament scene, right? Decks that are really doing well out in the wild, right? Going up against players that are really trying to win, really going at it and like really teching potentially against you specifically if you're kind of the hotness, or just decks in general that are being played a lot and you're going to be playing against a lot. So I took your deck and I looked at like you said, the Mad King list and where it sits now. And actually, you're only about 19 cards off, which isn't that much because about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like almost 7 of the 19 cards are lands, right? Just small differences in lands. And so those almost don't.
I was going to say 19 cards seems like a lot.
I mean, that's 20%, right? Like that's 20%.
Yeah. And if you're cutting out the land base, it's way more.
Right.
But I guess because we're at the inclusion of a little bit of changes with lands, you said it's like 12.
Yeah. So 12% difference isn't that bad, right? And so what I'm going to ask you about now is mainly just kind of like your deck against what is now considered the standard. I also took a look against this list, the standard list against decks that have done well in the current meta, that is the tournament scene now. And so one of the big things I noticed that you don't run, actually, let's start with what you still run that some of the decks don't run is Twin Flame Dualcaster Mage. You mentioned that you play it, you actually win with it a lot. Is there a world where you potentially remove that? It is kind of an efficient combo. It's only 2 cards, but like I said, I don't see it in too many other lists right now.
Yeah, notably as well, I also run Heat Shimmer, so it's almost like I'm using 3 slots for this combo, which a lot of people may frown upon, but I do find it as a really, really consistent win con. One of the reasons why is because I feel like all of the pieces of this win con actually do things separately. So without the combo, all of these cards are still very good.
Yeah.
Or they're in different combos. So Dualcaster Mage is really powerful, even if I'm just trying to copy a counterspell or use it as protection. It is versatile as a card, so I never feel bad throwing a Dualcaster combo into anything. Same with Twin Flame, right? So if at its base form it's creating a copy, so I can still use it to copy something or copy something in swing because it gives it haste. So I don't hate these cards. They're not combo pieces that are dead on their own, which is really valuable to me, and that's kind of why I run it. I will say that the biggest downside to them, and the reason I think people are running it less now, is the One Ring.
Yeah.
So when people have protection from everything, it's really hard to win through combat. Even if I have an infinite number of 1/1s, I cannot hurt the person who played a 4-cost spell the turn before me.
With protection from everything.
Darn.
Oh, yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Darn. So I think that's why it's significantly weaker. But because I like the cards as is, and they have been, like, I can't tell you the number of times I've used Dualcaster Mage to just counter somebody else's counter. It's sweet. It's super valuable.
Yeah, and the fact that if you're still running that, Twin Flame also notably lets you copy your Dockside, right? At least once, right? And so it gets you another Dockside to get you more treasures to go back to doing what you want to do, which is sacking something to draw you cards and making your commander bigger. That totally makes sense. But that kind of does lead me into my next kind of question is like, some of the lists, actually a good number of the lists are running a Food Chain and Squee combo. Food Chain is an enchantment that lets you sacrifice a creature and create a number of mana based off of that creature's converted mana cost, CMC. Squee is a creature that you can cast. It's a 3-cost, 2 and a red, that you can cast from either exile or your graveyard. And so the combo here is, for those people who don't know, is to sacrifice Squee to Food Chain, creating mana, which would trigger your commander, Korvold, and then kind of net you infinite mana as well as an infinite amount of sacrifices that would let you draw your deck. Have you looked into running this combo?
So I've seen it in a lot of other lists. I do, for whatever reason in my mind, it seems like a little bit too... It seems like too much to me.
Yeah.
I feel like it is a little bit more of a complicated combo, and the cards by themselves aren't the best unless you have the combo. It's not versatile from what I've seen, but it is effective. I do like that Food Chain is an enchantment, and a lot of the meta has kind of shifted a little bit where a lot of counter spells only target instants or sorceries. So I do like that it's a little more protective in what it is. And Squee, it doesn't really matter because if it gets countered, it's in your graveyard, it doesn't matter. You can just play Squee whenever you want. So Squee's cool. But I've considered it, but for now, it's something that I haven't seen. I haven't seen enough Korvolds really pressure and win with it for me to consider taking something out of my deck list that I've seen pretty consistent success with and replace it. Yeah. It does feel like it changes the deck a decent bit.
Okay, I'd be curious if you try to do it in the future. And then I think
yeah, and I might. I'm definitely interested in trying it because I've seen people win with it. But I think the question then becomes, the classic tale as old as time. What do I cut for it?
Yeah, I think the other card that I thought was really interesting. There are two more that kind of really stand out for me. The first is Scheming Symmetry. Scheming Symmetry is a tutor that lets you and another target opponent tutor for a card. And since you're already on a card called Opposition Agent, which is a 3-cost creature that when you can flash it in, and then when it comes into play, you basically take control of an opponent's search. I also looked and saw that you already run, I think, both Tainted Pact and Demonic Consultation, and so
just Tainted Pact.
You run Tainted Pact. So basically, the combo here for those people who don't know is to cast Scheming Symmetry, which is a sorcery speed. Hold priority, flash an Opposition Agent, and then basically take control of getting your search as well as your opponent's search. And you're assuming that in this meta, you can kind of target an opponent in blue that hopefully is running Thassa's Oracle, especially if they're in blue and black, which is, again, a really good possibility that they're running that. And then also that will pretty much help you win the game right there on the spot.
Yeah, this is something that I think just went over my head. I've looked at a lot of lists and I haven't seen. So I watch so much Commander, and I try to watch as many Korvold games as I possibly can. I don't think I've ever seen a Korvold player win with this, and I love it. I love this idea because I'm already kind of running this in a way with Praetor's Grasp.
Yeah. That's why I thought about it.
I've won many times just by Praetor's Grasping for someone's Thassa's Oracle and then playing Tainted Pact. I love that. I think anyone who runs black should do that because it's that easy. So I like the idea of this. It does kind of stink that you need Opposition Agent as well, so it is a multi-card combo, and I think the card by itself, Scheming Symmetry without Oppo, is bad. So letting your opponent search for a card is rough. On the good side, I could see it being useful if I have Dosan of the Fallen Leaf out, which is a card that I play for protection that says players can't cast spells during their turn. But even then, it kind of scares me because I believe with Scheming Symmetry, you can search for any card, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so even under those circumstances, if I point to a smart pilot, they could go and grab one of the channel lands and get rid of Korvold or grab one of the channel lands that can really put a damper on my day. So I'm not the biggest fan of that. And also something else I've been actually considering is when I'm thinking about making changes to this deck is potentially cutting Opposition Agent, which sounds insane.
No, I mean, I've made cuts like that before as well.
Yeah. Part of the reason why is just this deck is so fast, and in reality, I shouldn't be playing Police. I don't need to be playing Police. I just need to win the game faster. And that's why I look at Opposition Agent a lot of the time, and it's like, I'm never going to be holding up mana. Realistically, I'm playing everything and trying to win every single turn I'm playing. So it's hard. Opposition Agent has been on the chopping block, which is another reason why I think I haven't really looked into combos with Opposition Agent.
Cool. That's totally fair.
I love the idea.
That's totally
I'm definitely going to try it.
And then I think the last card that I really want to bring to your attention and see what your thoughts on it is this 1 red cost Goblin, which is really important because I like what it can do with a card called Skirk Prospector, which you also run. It's called Impulsive Pilferer, right? It's a 1 red. It's a 1/1. And then when Impulsive Pilferer dies, create a treasure token, right? And so with Skirk Prospector out, you can play that and play this. Sacrifice Impulsive Peel for 2 Skirk Prospector, make a red. This creates you a treasure token. And then the cool thing is this card also has this ability called Encore for 3 generic and 1 red. It reads, exile this card from your graveyard for each opponent. Hopefully there are still 3 opponents left. Create a token copy that attacks that opponent this turn if able. They gain haste, sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step, activate only as a sorcery. And so, again, with Skirk out, you would be able to gain 4 red plus another 4 treasures. I think, right? Is my math right there? Right? Because you'll sacrifice the original one, and then you can sacrifice the 3 copies, netting you. I mean, it's not like a full net gain because you would have to still pay for it, but that
the
is
Encore.
The Encore. But you still get 4 triggers of Korvold altogether for basically 5. I think you end up netting 1 mana. I haven't done the math. I think
plus treasures,
right? Because they create you treasures, so they kind of like repay themselves.
So this is something that someone else has brought to my attention pretty recently.
Okay.
This card needs to be in the deck.
Yeah, really.
Plain and simple. You don't have to do any convincing.
I did
to
it.
Me. You don't have to do any more convincing. This card, that's a good card.
This is a good card in this deck.
For this deck specifically, the way it works is not only am I getting sack triggers and drawing from the sack triggers of the creatures that die themselves, the encored creatures, but also they're giving me treasures, which with Korvold are even more card draw. Good. So this is like a 1 cost, draw 8 cards or draw 7 cards. Good. It's incredibly strong. I need to figure out how to get this in my deck. 100%. I'll cut a land for this thing.
Actually, I'm curious. I actually didn't look at that. How many lands?
I run a high amount of lands comparatively to a lot of other lists. I believe I run. Let me double check this. I believe I run 27 or 28.
That's actually pretty standard for CEDH.
Yeah, but I think a lot of the other Korvold decks are running like 25. So I run 28 lands.
25 is pretty low. I mean, 25 is low, and I play Kinnan. And Kinnan makes mana. I guess you we've already said that I've seen you having to pass the turn with if mana burn was still a thing, you would probably sometimes come real close to dying to mana burn. Mana burn was a mechanic that lasted until 2010. For those of you who don't know, where any unused mana would deal damage to you if you move through phases. It was very difficult to track.
That would be a serious problem. That would be a serious problem for me. But yeah, I do run a large number of lands in this deck. I run 28. I could definitely go to 27 and just play Impulsive Pilferer, especially since it's such a mana positive card. I could do it for sure. Or I potentially could cut a different mana dork for it. I could see myself cutting even like Elves of Deep Shadow for this card because I don't necessarily need a lot of black pips. I run all the rituals. Getting black pips is pretty easy. So I can find space for this card, and I'm glad that you brought it to my attention.
Cool. I'm glad I got you to consider at least one of the cards I brought to you, and you even said it. That's a good card. Well, thank you very much, Kyle, for walking me through your favorite commander and Korvold. I honestly, as I was researching this, and then after talking to you tonight, I'm really kind of interested in this deck. I'm always, I think every Magic player does this to degrees. Every one of them is always thinking about that next deck that they could try or put together and play. And this is definitely making the top of my list. So thank you very much for walking me through your favorite commander.
Yeah, thanks for listening, and thank you to the listeners for tuning in to this episode. Just a quick plug and shout out, we're streaming on YouTube and Spotify right now. We have Apple Podcasts on the way.
They're just
for those
being
Apple
really
listeners.
difficult. I promise you, I'm trying my best, but Apple doesn't make it easy. That's all I have to say about that. No bitterness.
Yeah, though we love Apple.
We do.
for when we
Absolutely.
when we will be on Apple Podcasts.
Agreed.
We'd love them so much. Yes. But another thing to mention, please join our Discord. We've had a couple people trickle in and join our wonderful community that we've built so far, our personal pod. We invite all of you and all the listeners who love CEDH and love deck teching or are just looking to play a game at night. Specifically, not a lot of people get on during the day,
Yep.
but at night,
For sure.
yeah, we are PST based as well, so the majority of us are on Pacific time zone. But yeah, come join our Discord and make some friends, deck tech, say hi to me or Ya. We hang out in there, and don't be a stranger. Also, please check us out on X at That's a Good Card for any announcements or uploads, and the links will be in our description below. So make sure you give us a like on our content and comment your thoughts on today's episode. We had a blast today. Thank you again, Ya, for joining me. And yeah, and we'll see you next time, y'all. Have a good one.
See you, everybody. Please share. Bye.
Bye.